hit the theme music and we'll get started.
Okay.
He talks about how he was over, I don't know how many Satanists, call them churches. He was like the bishop.
You gotta be kidding me.
What was in her heart? You don't know what sin she'd committed. You don't know how much unbelief was there. You don't know whether she hated her husband.
I don't think so.
Why would anybody spend so much time ranting and raving about something that they don't believe in?
Really?
Welcome to Skeptic's Brewpub with Brother Brewer. And welcome tonight to episode 12 of Skeptic's Brewpub. I'm your host, Brother Brewer, and joining me tonight all the way from the sunny North Kakalaki, we have the eminent Bible scholar, Dr. Robert M. Price with us tonight. How you doing tonight, Dr. Price?
Oh, doing great. Terrific. I hope you are.
Oh, I'm doing, if I was any better out here, I couldn't stand it. Well, I know you're kind of pressed for time tonight, so I actually had 2 pages of questions. I'm going to kind of cut these down some. Now, I did want to first of all ask you a little bit about a couple of books that you've got. One of them that just came out not too long ago, and then another one that I've been hearing that you've got in the works. The first one was Blaming Jesus for Jehovah.
This was a book I wrote at the suggestion of a friend of mine in Virginia who is pretty militant in his unbelief, especially toward the Catholic Church, to which some of his relatives belong, and he's had long-standing friendly debates with them. But he had this fascinating argument about how you can't do as many people sort of implicitly do and excuse Christianity in the New Testament for all of the barbarism of the Old Testament with the atrocities commanded by an angry Jehovah and so on. He says you cannot slip out of that if you believe in the Trinity, because it's not as if you're a Marcionite. These people that said in the 2nd century that God of the Old Testament is not the Father of Jesus Christ, but an altogether different deity, one who never punishes but only forgives and invites the creatures of the Old Testament God to jump ship and come over. I mean, those people had a consistent view that would allow them to divide the Testaments. But so-called Orthodox Christians don't. They say that Jesus and his Father and the Spirit are ultimately one God, and it seems to disallow the possibility of exonerating Jesus. People seem to have a kind of a good cop, bad cop model in mind, that Jehovah commits atrocity, but Jesus is all about love and hippiedom and so on, but that this just doesn't work unless you're a Marcionite. If Jesus is a member of the same Godhead as the Old Testament deity, there's no way to exonerate him. And I hadn't ever quite thought of it this way, and so I approached the question that way, hence the title, Blaming Jesus for Jehovah. And in fact, it gets worse in the Gospels, at least if you take them at face value, as most do, because then you've got Jesus outdoing the Old Testament God in ferocity by threatening people with eternal torment in a fiery hell. I mean, forget about the Canaanites getting butchered. I'd much rather undergo that than an eternal pit of torture. And and then in turn this kind of snowballs and renders incoherent the genuine enlightened morality you can also find in the Bible. That's there, but it just becomes crazy if the Father who loves his children so much and is attendant to their needs is going to send most of his creations to a fate of eternal torment. What are you even talking about anymore? And so the book kind of had that genesis. I wrote all the text, but I kind of collaborated with this man who had the ideas for this. I'd mention his name, but he doesn't really want any credit, unfortunately. And I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was sort of illuminating for me to get into all this stuff. So the goal of the book is to say, if you're any kind of a traditional Christian, you don't occupy the high moral ground. You need to take a serious look at this, because as long as your standard of righteousness, your God, is one who is willing to torture people, and I don't care who it is, in hell for eternity, well, you're redefining righteousness as compatible with that, and you may not put two and two together, but some people do, and it's easy to see how. You really have to renounce that.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of people have read it, and I've heard good reactions in general. I guess I read a few of them on Amazon, and a couple of people really didn't like it. Naturally, I'm surprised more didn't condemn it. But it's a brief little book, and but I try to be fair in it. And for instance, when I'm talking about the Jesus that everybody loves, I try to expound that in a sympathetic way to show, yes, you can see why people like this. You can see the true nobility in it. But the problem is we got this Mr. Hyde side. What are you going to do with that? You can just pick out what you want, but then you're the authority, not the Bible. And so it kind of tries to confront readers with this, with contradictions in the Bible and so on, and says, look, for the sake of your intellectual integrity, you can't just turn the page and say, well, they'll explain all this in the big Bible seminar when I get to heaven. No, you can't leave it open that way. So it's a direct challenge, I think, not a nasty one, but it is pretty brutal in its frankness.
It is in its frankness, and I really appreciated that. Coming at it actually from the atheist side now, but just fresh enough, remembering what it was like for me as a believer, and getting, I guess, more succinct arguments against it than what I could voice on my own. It really helped me to solidify some of the things that I had been seeing in there too. Like for me with Jesus, number one, I agree with some things that you've said in the past, that he very much becomes a ventriloquist dummy, that you basically can sit him on your lap and he can say whatever you want him to say. He can be the socialist Jesus, he can be conservative Jesus, he can be the NRA gun-toting Jesus, just whichever one you want, because they're all in there, and you can just pick and choose what you want him to say.
It kind of lends all new meaning to the phrase personal savior. You've got one customized according to your biases.
Pretty much. That's pretty much seems like how it works. But yeah, I really love that book, and I'm looking forward also to your the one that you've been talking about on the Bible Geek, the Holy Fable. What all's going on with that one for some folks that may not be familiar with what you're doing?
Well, I was approached by a new publisher. I think it was called Free Thought House. It was run by a man I knew from the Jesus Seminar from some years back, and he said he wanted a critical introduction to the Bible for interested critical readers, people that love the Bible. They don't think like some atheists do that it's Mein Kampf. They're really sympathetic to it, but they're not going to swallow the fairy tales and so forth anymore. And would I undertake this? And I agreed to, and right before I got done with it, I got an email from the publisher saying, sorry, the publishing endeavor has collapsed. Investors have withdrawn, and they were leaving me in the lurch. But I knew another publisher would be interested, and within the same day, they agreed to do it. This book is going to be hundreds of pages. I really can't even guess. It took me 2 years to write. I've done 2 doctoral dissertations years apart. Each of them took me 2 weeks to write. This thing took me 2 years to write. And basically, I have a chapter on every major block of Scripture, like Genesis by itself, and then the other 4 books of the Pentateuch by themselves, and then the Deuteronomistic history, Joshua through 2 Kings all together, and then the Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Chronicles, the Psalms, Song of Solomon, and other music lyrics, wisdom literature, the prophets is a huge chapter. And I go into introductory questions, and then the New Testament, I've got the Gospels and the epistles and so on. Each time I'm doing the standard introductory questions like, who wrote this, what kind of person wrote it, what's the viewpoint here, and what are the major high points that are important. And those also I try to approach sympathetically, but also critically to show when there's contradiction, there's mythology, false predictions, and so on. And that's what the whole title of the thing is, Holy Fable, the Bible Undistorted by Faith. So I'm trying to not distort it either according to people who make the Bible into an idol, or people that hate the Bible because they hate their own religious background. And so this thing winds up being an introductory volume and kind of a commentary. I once thought of doing something like this and thought, that's just too much. I could never do it. But this got me into doing it and reading a lot of stuff I hadn't before, and I just found it thoroughly fascinating, and even came up with some stuff I've never read before in professional Old Testament scholars and so forth. So I think it may be my magnum opus possibly, and I'm eager for it to come out, but I don't know exactly when because it's so darn long. I don't know how long it'll take the publisher.
Well, I am definitely looking forward to it, and it actually brings me into some of the other topics that I wanted to hit on tonight, because I have been someone who's just been interested in not just the Bible itself, but the history behind it, what was going on in the cultures. Because even when I was a liberal Christian, I believed that to understand it, you had to know what was going on, not just within Israel and Judah, but also with the Canaanites and with Mesopotamia and Egypt and all of these other places, because it all ties together. And some of the things that I've wondered, and I've heard you touch on them a few times on the Bible Geek, was now you've talked about before a theory that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that maybe at one point, it strikes me that maybe at one point they weren't related, but that they were that Isaac acts as kind of like maybe a bridge to put those two together so that Israel and Judah could become basically one nation. Is that?
Yeah. There was a great Old Testament scholar, Albrecht Alt, who did a seminal essay called The Gods of the Fathers, and not everybody agrees with this, even among critics, but I found it pretty enticing. He said that probably one group was looked back to a patriarch, Abraham, as their progenitor, probably a fictitious character, though there could have been one back there somewhere, and maybe a group of tribes. But then there was, then this would have been probably in the north, and then there would have been a bunch of tribes who similarly had an eponymous ancestor, Jacob, who was again fictively the ancestor of all of them, and that they posited such a common ancestor to seal alliances or federations of tribes. Oh, we're all blood brothers because we're all the children of Abraham or of Jacob. And that Isaac may have been yet another one. And so and Alt pointed to a fascinating passage or two where they seem to be listing different deities connected with these patriarchs. It says the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac, which is a fascinating title indicating the eerie numinousness of the encounter with this God, and the mighty one of Jacob. Now, we usually read these things as just synonymous names for one God, but Alt said it kind of sounds like that these were originally three different deities of these three tribal confederations, and when they eventually joined together for the sake of trade relations and military security and so on, they decided that the three patrons of their tribes must have been related too, and so the oldest and most powerful would have been the Abraham League. The next would have been the Isaac group, and then Jacob would have been the most recent, probably the most recently federated or whatever. And so they decided that was the pecking order, but that they're all closely related, and therefore so are the tribes. And this isn't unusual for ancient tribal leagues